hasn't heard of Giorgio Vasari? His Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects isn't simply the most famous work of art history ever written. It's unquestionably nothing less than the founding work of the entire discipline. Engaging in the history of art without Vasari would be like imagining philosophy without Plato, or geometry without Euclid. Simply inconceivable. Of course, Vasari was himself a painter and architect, the principal court artist to Grand Duke Cosimo de' Medici, who ran one of the most successful and prolific workshops of the age, but whose creations are now widely ignored by all but a few professional art historians. Syracuse University's Sally Cornelison is one of them. She, too, long unreflectively viewed Vasari as an artistic also-ran, but a chance encounter with one of his paintings led her down the long and fruitful road of rigorously reappraising many of his artistic accomplishments, culminating in her latest book, Vasari and the Sacred Image, Renovating Santa Maria della Pieve in Arezzo. Over 450 years after his death, maybe it's time that the rest of us finally rediscovered this most influential of artists hiding in plain sight. Sally Cornelison, welcome to Exploring Art History.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So today we're going to be talking about not only the subject of your new book, but the subject of something that you've spent an awful lot of time thinking about and writing about and pondering and so forth, which is all about Giorgio Vasari and his work in Arezzo, but probably more generally about Giorgio Vasari. And I thought it would make sense to give an introduction to Vasari about his life and his works, because a lot of people are familiar with his lives, but not so many people, I think, are as familiar with his work as a painter and architect.
Yes, absolutely true. And in my book, in the introduction, I make the point that there's a scholar who commented that, Vasari is so famous for having written the lives of the artists, but he himself would have, defined himself first and foremost as a painter. That is, what he started out doing. He also had some training in carpentry and other things. Vasari is kind of the person that people love to hate in Renaissance studies. He's so foundational. And I was just giving a talk the other day in which the issue came up that most of us are taught that Vasari was a bad artist. That's what I grew up thinking. Most of us are taught that when Vasari's writing the lives, he's just making stuff up. And now we know much better about his MO, what was guiding him and why he does tell stories. He's usually making points. A lot of times what he's doing, the rhetoric is grounded in classical precedent. Like anybody, he's picking and choosing and curating how he's presenting both himself and other people. And Vasari, the artist, this is one of the reasons I got into this project, is that I did a small exhibition when I taught at the University of Kansas. They have a Vasari painting at the Spencer Museum of Art, and I curated this. It was a 2-room exhibition, but it was the first time I'd done anything like that. Had never been interested in Vasari before, and what that did was to open up to me, A, how interesting he is as an artist, and B, how little in general, especially compared to other big-name Italian Renaissance folk, how little has been done on his paintings. And it's just, it was something that opened up in ways that I didn't think would happen. One of the things, the joys of working on him as an artist is that he's so well documented. He's very chatty. We have the lives. He talks about his work, other people's work. He talks about precedents. He kept a list, actually 2 lists. We have 2 copies. One's in Arezzo and one's at Yale University's Beinecke Library, of what he calls his ricordanze, his remembrances, his lists of works that he'd done from the start of his life to close to the end of his life. There's correspondence, ample correspondence that survives. There are the works of art themselves that survive. And as somebody, I spent a lot of my career working on saints and relics and ritual and commemoration, going back as far as the 13th century when you don't have that kind of documentation. And so that was one of the things that I really enjoyed getting into with him, and trying to explore not even blockbuster works of art. Some of the works that I deal with in this book are, admittedly kind of minor works by Vasari. Some of them, almost nothing has been written on them, but I love playing detective. Looking at his art is rewarding in a number of ways in terms of understanding patronage networks, how he's thinking through things. There's a certain contingent that thinks that Vasari wasn't very smart. I actually think he was thinking very carefully about his legacy, about what came before, and how he could craft works that really joined the two together. So he's, I have in the process of working on him, and so I started really delving into him around 2010. So, it's been a while when I was working on that exhibition. But I ran into a lot of pushback. I tried to get some grants, and sometimes you can get the feedback from the readers who are evaluating your grants. And on one occasion, some of the feedback I got was, there's no way she's going to convince me that Vasari is worth studying as a painter, which I think is limiting, very limiting. And I published an article about 5 or 6 years ago, and one of the reviewers said, well, if there's not been anything written on this painting before, then maybe there's a reason for that. And in fact, I uncovered a lot of stuff. So there are these prejudices. And so I think also there's something kind of contrary in me that made me want to learn more about him and share what I have learned about him, so that we actually have a better conception of what he was doing as a painter.
Okay, I'd like to talk a little bit about what he's actually done more generally. Mm-hmm. But before I do, prompted by your comments, I'd like to turn to your own personal story and your experience. So I understand the standard stereotype: Vasari's a lousy painter. He should only be looked at seriously for his contribution to art history, which was, of course, massive, overwhelmingly so, through his lives. And I'm guessing that at some point you unthinkingly, or for a long time, you had unthinkingly bought into that story. And then at some point you started to come out of it. And you mentioned this painting at the University of Kansas, but perhaps it was before then. Can you document a little bit your own conversion to Vasari's worth as an artist?
It actually comes out of working on that Kansas painting and doing that exhibition. That painting had been attributed to kind of everybody but Vasari, and when I arrived at Kansas, it was, I think, attributed to the circle of Giorgio Vasari. The more I got into it, as I said before, the more I realized that there is a lot of really interesting, important, information to be gleaned from his work. But there are other scholars, like any good art historian, I stand on the shoulders of giants. There's a scholar named Patricia Rubin who taught for many, many years at the Courtauld Institute in London, later went to NYU's Institute of Fine Arts, and she wrote a really important book called Giorgio Vasari, Art and History, in which she is going in and saying, look, it is too facile to just dismiss him as this unreliable, not terribly smart, not terribly talented artist. We really need to know how to read Vasari's lives. And that was very influential for me, because what I wanted to do was to do the same thing for his paintings, which really, people haven't, obviously there are exceptions, but they have not been analyzed with the kind of care that they really deserve. So it's easy to brush off something if you're not really knowledgeable about what went into it, and are figuring out what he was looking at and what he was trying to do with them. So it just grew over time. The more I learned, the more interesting he became. And so this book was actually supposed to be much more than it was. I wound up focusing on the Church of the Pieve in Arezzo, but it was actually going to be case studies of Vasari works in Florence, Bologna, Rome, and Arezzo. And then the Arezzo one just kind of took over. But that's the beauty of doing art history or any kind of research, is that it takes you places where you don't think you're going to go. And the important thing is to listen to the material, listen to the research, use your eyes, and really, rethink how we approach these things. And so hopefully I've done that for a little corner of Vasari studies. His output was prodigious. So, to work on him, you really do kind of need to limit it in some way. Otherwise, you'll be drowning in Vasari paintings.
Well, perhaps at the end, we can get back to future projects, which may or may not involve Vasari and the extent of your drowning. But let's leave that for a little while. A personal comment. One of the things that I've noticed, and I'm not an art historian, but I've looked fairly carefully at some of these topics over time, is that it's very clear just from his perspective as a biographer. And I know, as you said, there are many people who take issue with a lot of what he said, and a lot of what he said has proven to be incorrect or exaggerating or fabricated. But the vast majority, I would say, of what he said has actually proven to be accurate. I mean, he's a human being, and he has his own agendas, as all human beings do in their time and place and so forth. But it wasn't as if he just kicked back with a glass of wine and started writing whatever he wanted to with the lives. He went to a tremendous amount of effort to chase down primary sources, to talk to people, to look at things, to reveal an enormous amount of personal information that otherwise would not have been accessible to anybody at the time, let alone 500 years from now. And sometimes I think that's not as appreciated as it should be either. The colleague that you mentioned hopefully has had some effect and impact, and maybe people appreciate it more. But that was a little bit astounding to me. I did a film a while ago on Raphael, and I found there were a lot of people who had this reaction who I would talk to, which is, oh yeah, Vasari said this, and it must be crap because he just was inventing things left, right, center, and sideways. And with respect to Raphael, he did have an agenda, and some of the things he said, I think, are now regarded as being contentious or dubious or whatever. But an awful lot of the things he did were clearly veridical. We know that he was friends with Giulio Romano. He went and talked to a lot of people. He took that job of being a biographer extremely seriously. And I think that seems to be underappreciated by a significant number of people still in the art historical community. At least that's my perspective.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And with regard to Raphael was Vasari's hero, I think probably even more than Michelangelo.
Oh, really?
Because Raphael was a painter, and as a painter, Vasari really, Michelangelo did things that Vasari in his artistic life did not do, in terms of sculpture and things like that. And Pat Rubin, in her book, she actually has a really nice discussion of, what a touchstone Raphael and his work were for Vasari. You may or may not be familiar with the term campanilismo. So a campanile in Italian is a bell tower. Campanilismo refers to that a kind of localization in terms of agendas, whether they're personal agendas, political agendas, that you only look as far as you can see from the top of your own campanile, your own bell tower. And Vasari is campanilistic, like everyone. So he often gets a lot of flack for not doing certain things and, overly promoting Tuscany and the Medici court. I think the question to ask would be, why wouldn't he do that? And he definitely does kind of bad turns to some artists, marginalizes them. Andrea del Sarto is one, as Elizabeth Pilliot has shown. He really kind of crafted a story regarding Pontormo and Bronzino that was not necessarily reflective of who they were and what they were. But that agenda serves him. And so it makes sense. He's not getting into, Venetian art that much because that's not what he's interested in. And you can't do everything. So you need to keep that in mind. It would be unusual if he were inclusive. We want him to be inclusive, but that's just not how things worked back then.
Yeah, and I think part of this, I'm speculating obviously, but I think part of this is a corollary of having been so remarkably successful. As the founding go-to source for anything that happened during this time period, I'm guessing that even he, at his most hubristic moments, would not have imagined the disproportionate impact that he has had over the centuries. And as such, rather than looking at one person's views and opinions and efforts, however comprehensive they may have been, he's looked at the writer of the art history Bible, and as such, he's taken to task, well, you didn't pay enough attention to this, and you didn't pay enough attention to that. And perhaps, as I said, that's a product of being the victim of his own success to some extent.
Right. I totally agree with you. I really, you summed it up very, very beautifully. Just to kind of dive back into the issue of, is Vasari a good artist or a bad artist, and how those kinds of things have been perpetuated. Vasari he's a workshop man. And so he's not always painting the works, it's Giovanni Stradano, it's Polpi, all of the people in his orbit are doing a lot of the work for him. And you recently did a couple of podcasts with William Wallace, who's done, wonderful things showing that, Michelangelo wasn't working alone. He was very much a collaborative artist, manager, etc. Yet we have this persistent idea of people like Michelangelo and Raphael and Leonardo as being these kind of lone geniuses who, were doing their own thing, whereas Vasari's a company guy. And he was actually very representative of his time in terms of how he worked, but based on mostly 19th century ideas about what an artist should be, he's kind of fallen by the wayside. And the point I'm trying to make here is that this man, he painted for popes. I forget how many he worked for, five different popes, I think. The Medici, major religious orders. If he's that bad, why are all these people hiring him? They had pretty good taste. They knew what they wanted, and he delivered, right? He finished things. He finished them relatively efficiently, sometimes at the expense of the quality, sometimes not. But it's important to, keep that in mind. And that workshops, Renaissance workshops don't necessarily conform to more modern ideas of what an artist is and what makes a great artist.
Yeah, he was hired by, as you say, the leading patrons of the day. He also had impeccable artistic credentials. He came from the workshop of, I believe, Andrea del Sarto. He had colleagues such as Rosso Fiorentino and so forth. This was not some wacky outsider in his basement somewhere just doing stuff. He was very much a product of the artistic establishment, and that's, well, anyway, you summed it up very well. But I also had those thoughts. It's disrespectful at some level to those people who were there then and who valued his contributions. And perhaps before we move on to La Pieve, because I do obviously want to focus on that, I can ask you to give me some details of his accomplishments as a painter, both as an oil painter and in fresco, and also his contributions as an architect, because as you said, he was remarkably prolific.
Right. So he was also an excellent draftsman. There are some just staggeringly beautiful drawings that he did. And there's a wonderful catalog that came out in, I think, 2015 of Vasari's drawings. So he's a great draftsman. In terms of paintings, he kind of does it all. He does portraits, he does sacred art. My specialty is sacred art. But of course, there are mythological scenes. There are the decorations that he did in Florence's Palazzo Vecchio, which during Vasari's time was the ducal palace where Duke Cosimo I de' Medici and his family actually resided. He works in the papal palace in a variety of places. He did a series of chapels. He painted what's called the Sala Regia, which is a large room adjacent to the Sistine Chapel. So he did everything. He painted ephemeral works. So if, for example, the baptism of Medici children, which took place in the baptistry in Florence, there would be canvases that he painted that were brought out on those occasions, and you could roll them up and then reuse them later on. Designed processions. The architecture, he designs the Uffizi in Florence. He redesigns churches, the Church of the Badia in Arezzo. He worked on a church in Pistoia. Today architecture is a profession. In the Renaissance, many architects were people like Giotto or Michelangelo or Vasari, who actually started off working in another medium, whether it's sculpture or painting, and then kind of just because they are successful, get brought in to architectural projects. And I guess one of the best examples of Vasari's architecture, you could go to the Uffizi in Florence, or also in Arezzo, right behind the Church of the Pieve. There's a large piazza called the Piazza Grande, and he did this large loggia, so a kind of porch-like structure that was meant to house offices and things like that, and shops, etc. That was one of his last projects, and it is one of the loveliest spaces in the lovely town of Arezzo.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, he, in addition to his many other architectural and painterly accomplishments, he renovated several churches. I suppose properly that should be considered within architecture, but anyway, he renovated several churches, and at least three of them that I'm aware of, which is Santa Maria Novella and Santa Croce. But as you said, La Pieve in Arezzo was not only the first of those, and largely overlooked, but also had a special attachment to him because, as I understand it, that's where he was actually baptized. I mean, he's from Arezzo, and that was really a homecoming to some extent. So I want to get into, obviously, La Pieve and all of the ramifications and all of the fascinating aspects that you've discovered and written about. But my first question is, why do you think that has been as overlooked as it has been?
That's an excellent question. It's mostly because of what happened to the Church of the Pieve. It's Arezzo. And so Arezzo, just because it was under Florentine rule at the time, it has always been kind of marginalized, much like Vasari himself, in terms of his artistic production. The Pieve, and I talk about this in my book, especially in the last chapter, it was renovated in the late 19th century. So from about through the 1860s into the 1870s. What the renovators wanted to do was to take the church back to what they thought it looked like before Vasari did his own renovation of the church. So it was during a period when neo-medievalizing was very fashionable. You had, Notre Dame in Paris and all sorts of other cities and towns, kind of going back to their medieval roots. And what they did was they took everything out. Only a very few works that were in the Pieve made it back into the church after the renovation. All of Vasari's paintings were removed. Every trace of him in that church was removed. And they actually radically reconstructed the east end of the church so that to what they thought it looked like, but they were wrong. Today, it has a split level east end. So there's a crypt and then there's a raised choir where the high altar is. And that's not what it looked like. There were a couple of steps leading up to a slightly elevated east end, but only just a little bit. And so when you go to the Pieve today, beautiful medieval church, but you just need to bear in mind that it doesn't look like what it looked like. And so when they took all of those works of art out, they just simply broke up the contribution of Vasari, and those paintings were moved to different churches. Two of them wound up in the Church of the Badia. One of them he built the altar but never finished the painting. He died before he could do the altarpiece. Another one was already rather damaged from humidity that was occurring in the left aisle of the church. It's in Arezzo's State Museum of Medieval and Modern Art. And I think because of that reconstruction in the 19th century, the dispersal of all of those paintings, that it just hasn't been analyzed. The Florentine renovations that post-date Vasari's renovations in Arezzo, absolutely. There's a scholar named Marcia Hall who's taught at Temple University for many, many years, who did a really important study in the 1970s of Vasari's renovations of Santa Croce and Santa Maria Novella for Duke Cosimo I. But what he does there is largely based on what he had done earlier in Arezzo. And yeah, the Pieve, I say this a few times in the book. It was one of the most personal projects of his life, because he was baptized there. Everybody always gives his birth date as July the 30th in 1511. That's the date he was baptized. I kind of doubt that he was, born and they immediately took him over. I have a feeling he was probably born like on the 28th or the 29th or something like that. But those records, the baptismal records, are still around, and it's very well documented. And it's not just that he was baptized there, but the house that he lived in as a child with his family was located nearby. So it was their parish church. His family members were buried there. The Vasari family came to Arezzo from the city of Cortona, which is a little bit further to the south. And that was probably about the middle of the 15th century. And he talks in the Lives of the Artists about how in the Pieve was the tomb of his great-grandfather, Lazarus Vasari, his grandfather, who was Giorgio Vasari, so he was named after his grandfather, and other relatives. So it was their burial church. And one of the altars that he builds is the high altar, which is not only the high altar, but it also holds the most important relics in the church. It is where the sacrament tabernacle is, and it's the Vasari family funerary chapel. So it's just like, this really large, freestanding, multifunctional monument to the Pieve, to the saints of Arezzo, to the relics in the church, but also to Vasari and his family. And it really couldn't be anywhere other than the Pieve. One of the points I bring up is that, you'd think he'd maybe want to be buried in Florence, because that was, where he worked for the Medici dukes, and he founded the Florentine Academy of Design, all of these things. But Arezzo, he was very clear in his will that when he died, he wanted his body transported. This is very well documented. After he died, and they, carted his body down to Arezzo. It was actually accompanied by 4 flagellant friars who were whipping themselves as they went to the city gate. And, there was money for candles that they burned because that's where he wanted to wind up with his family members in the Pieve.
I'd like to get into some of the details of your research, but just another maybe meta question or comment about this. So I'm imagining myself in your situation, and I think you're working on the renovations and the architectural renovations, the altarpieces, the artwork, and so forth that Vasari did in this church. And it's kind of a good news, bad news situation, because the bad news is that's all been changed. And the altarpieces have left, and they're here and they're there, and the paintings are up and down and so forth, or at least mostly. There are some remnants, of course, but the vast majority of major things has been moved somewhere else. And yet at the same time, there seems to be a tremendous amount of documentation about this that often we don't have access to. Is that a fair assessment of your state of mind as you're going through this?
Absolutely. And I was really indebted to the work of an old friend of mine, a scholar by the name of Giovanni Freni. We were actually in graduate school together at the Courtauld Institute in London. And Giovanni is a medievalist. And his PhD thesis was the cathedral in the Pieve in Arezzo. And he was analyzing the chapels. And so he dug up all of this information about what chapels were in there, before Vasari. So he was focusing on the 14th century. And so I was really dependent on Giovanni's work for understanding what came before to figure out what Vasari had done, but also how His works in the Pieve referenced what had been there earlier. There are descriptions. I worked in, I counted them up the other day, I think 6 or 7 different archives to, glean as much information. Some of the documentation has been known for a long time, but I was trained to do archival work. And so it's always been a really important part of my scholarship. And there was a lot to dive into. There are church records, there were 19th century descriptions before the renovation, all sorts of things I could look to in order to put it together. If I'd had more time, maybe I already took a lot of time to finish this project, but I think this is a project that would be ripe for a digital humanities reconstruction. Work with somebody to figure out what the church looked like. And this is kind of what I do in the penultimate chapter of the book, is literally walk the reader through what would you see when you came in the front door. On the left is Vasari's Kamayanni altar. On the right is the altar he did for an important confraternity. Then you get to the east end, which is the high altar, and then 2 other important altars. And how did they change as you move through the church and experience them? And what was he thinking about? Because he was definitely thinking about this. One of the main differences between his renovation of the Pieve and the Florentine renovations is that the Florentine ones were much more cohesive. This was a much more piecemeal project. It started off with, he was originally given the altar at the end of the left aisle to turn into his own funerary chapel. Later that gets moved to the high chapel, and then subsequently he adds other altars. So this is over about a 15-year period that this happens. But even so, and the architecture of all the altars wasn't exactly the same, but there is kind of a rhyme and a reason, while at the same time each one advertises the patronage of the altar, the iconography that was important to the Pieve. The Pieve is dedicated to the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, and so there is Marian imagery kind of dominates most of Vasari's work there. The high altar is a bit of an exception, kind of unusually.
Yeah, and you also talk about how these altarpieces are related to one another, and there's a thematic aspect to their interrelationship within the church. It's not as if there's just, well, there's this altar and that altar. There is a sense of synergy between them, it seems.
Right, exactly. And again, it's not as cohesive. So at Santa Croce in Florence, all of the altarpieces show the story of Christ's passion. So, starting off with things like the Last Supper and winding up with scenes like Pentecost and the Ascension, etc. At the Pieve, it is not necessarily that cohesive, but on the high altar, kind of curiously, the main panel of the high altar is an absolutely gorgeous panel. What I like to say is that if you think that Vasari is a bad painter, look at the main panel on the front of the high altar from the Pieve, a scene of Christ calling Saints Peter and Andrew, which is a work that he repurposed. A couple of his Pieve paintings were meant for other patrons, meant for other places. And so this one was actually commissioned from him by Pope Julius III. Julius III was Pope from about 1550 to 1555, and Vasari never got paid for it. The Pope dies, and there is a pretty long paper trail from the early 1550s up until the year 1560, 1561, when he manages to get it back. It had been at the Vatican, and he puts it on the front and center on this altar, when in fact it would have been more appropriate to have an image of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary. There's a tiny little panel up at the top that shows Mary going up into heaven. But I think the idea that this was a papal commission, a very prestigious commission. One scholar has pointed out that it features St. Peter, who's the name saint of Vasari's youngest brother. It was Pietro Vasari's sons who became Vasari's heirs because he did not have any legitimate heirs to pass things down to. And that is, it's an extraordinary work of art.
I'd like to ask some follow-up questions about this because I was quite captivated by some of these ideas that you were writing about. So returning to the point that you just made, which is that it seems like it would have made much more sense to have a painting in the high altar that was a painting dedicated to the Assumption of Mary, not only because of the smaller tondo or oval painting above it, but also because the entire church was dedicated to the Assumption of Mary. And you did some work to develop a thesis that in fact he had done a sketch that was along those lines, and for some reason that didn't come to pass, and he, as you also said, to some extent spoiled the iconography by inserting this painting, however marvelous it is, and it is a marvelous painting. And I'm wondering why you think that might have been the case. I mean, it seems a bit odd to me.
It's very odd. The drawing to which you referred is one that had always been associated with the first altar that Vasari was supposed to do, the one that was supposed to go at the end of the left aisle of the Pieve. It's a drawing that is in the Uffizi, the collection, the drawings collection at the Uffizi in Florence. And for that altar, he was thinking of a scene of the raising of Lazarus. It's a resurrection theme, which is appropriate for a family funerary chapel. His grandfather's name is Lazarus, so you can kind of kill two birds with one stone. And this was really an 11th hour addition to my book, because as I was preparing the final manuscript, this is where a lot of repetitive, close looking comes into play, because you can just, look at things forever and not really see what's going on. And in that drawing, I realized it's like, that's not a raising of Lazarus. It's got all the ingredients of, a tomb space, pointing apostles. It's got to be the apostles' tomb part of an Assumption of the Virgin Mary. The altar, the high altar, is dedicated to the Assumption. The previous altarpiece, which is a very important polyptych by the Sienese painter Pietro Lorenzetti, has Marian scenes of the Madonna and Child, the Annunciation, and then at the top, the Assumption of the Virgin. And so the really curious thing is why the Pieve officials allowed him to deviate from that Marian iconography. I honestly think he got his hands on that painting from Rome that he had been trying to get for about a decade, and put it in there. And it really did alter the tradition of Marian iconography, which I think he makes up for in the other altar pieces, because it's all Mary all the time in the other ones that he did for the church.
Yeah. That brings up another question that I had, which is, how is it possible that he could have really built this enormous monument to himself as the high altar of the church? So I don't pretend to know all the details about church administration at any time, let alone in the 16th century. But it does seem a little bit odd. I understand that he was very wealthy and very accomplished, and he was a child of Arezzo, and he was very proud to be, and I'm sure people were grateful for the work he was doing at the Pieve and so forth and so on. But still, it seems odd that he was given really so much latitude to be able to build this double-sided altar as a tomb monument effectively for himself and his family, with references to St. George, his namesake, all over the place. At some point you talk about him having been able to smuggle in the shield of St. George to one of the paintings, even though he was expressly forbidden to do that. I mean, which seems a bit silly at that point, and forbidding him to do that, given everything else that he was able to accomplish. So this was bemusing to me, the idea that he had so much latitude to create this monument to his own magnificence and immortality. And I think we'd like to get back to that immortality in terms of by way of reputation, obviously. Can you shed any light on that? Because that was a bit confusing to me, how he was given so much latitude.
Immortality is the theme of the lives of the artists. In writing those biographies, he allows artists to live on in perpetuity, himself included. And this altar is the physical and visual embodiment of the same conception. But he's actually packing so much in there. So on that altar, there are 26 panel paintings, there are sculptures, there's a lot going on, and it's very unusual in terms of artists' funerary monuments for an artist to be given patronage rights to the high altar. I mean, even Michelangelo, he's buried next to his family altar in the Church of Santa Croce in Florence. Vasari, by the way, painted the altarpiece, which is immediately adjacent to Michelangelo's monument. And I've done some work on that. The Pieve officials, and this is pretty much any church, they're usually pretty protective of the high altar as being, the most important altar in the church and something that is not meant to aggrandize specific people. So even when he got permission to build that side aisle altar, which was the first one he was supposed to do, he got permission to do that in 1559. In the documents, he proposes this altar. I think he had a drawing. I think he had a very complete drawing to show them. And so they knew what it was going to look like. And for that reason, I think we're probably like, okay, we're okay with that. Do what you want as long as you're paying for it. And that will be all right. But there are some restrictions. You are not supposed to put your coat of arms on it. It should only show up on the tomb. And they were very specific about this, even with regard to the high altar, is that the tomb was supposed to be in the floor near the high altar. And you could put his coat of arms on that, but not anywhere else, not elsewhere on the altar. There is an inscription on the bottom, as you're facing the altar, on the bottom right-hand side that names him as the patron of the altar. An inscription on the other side identifies the saints whose relics are kept inside the altar. But you're absolutely right. I mean, he had a certain status, and that, I think, was one of the things that allowed him to convince the Pieve officials to give him rights to that high altar. But it is a double altar, so it actually has an altar table at the front and an altar table at the back, which is not unprecedented. There are a number of these, and there's, especially from late medieval Italy, there are some very good examples that Vasari would have known. But in that first altar that he was supposed to build, he wanted to dedicate it to Saint Mustiola. She's a really obscure early Christian virgin martyr, and the altar in that part of the church had always been dedicated to her. So they were very clear about wanting to maintain the original dedication. He wants to add a dedication to his patron Saint George. And they basically say, no, you have to keep the St. Mustiola dedication. By moving to the high altar and creating a freestanding structure, you can have an altar at the front that's dedicated to the Virgin Mary, to the Assumption of the Virgin, and there are documents that support this. And then you have the altar at the back, which is dedicated to St. George. I think one of the reasons he got away with this is that the really super overt pro-Vasari family iconography is all at the back. This is what the priests would be looking at, because they would be seated in the choir behind the high altar. And there's a beautiful painting predominantly executed by Vasari's assistant Giovanni Stradano, showing St. George killing the dragon, so big St. George. And then there are portraits down below of his great-grandfather Lazarus and grandfather Giorgio, and then his parents, Maddalena, and his father Antonio. And we know from what he tells us is that the family members were actually buried behind the altar. So it's not, the most prominent thing on the altar. When you go into the church, when the priest is celebrating the main mass, what you're seeing is less Vasarian iconography. There are a lot of images of saints who are named saints of members of the Vasari family, but they're on the sides and they're, around the back in particular. So I think by creating a big double-sided one, he's able to get away with this. There's a little door, and that led to a stair that provided access to a crypt that's below the altar. On that right side, directly above the door that leads to the relics, is a portrait of Vasari as Lazarus, Saint Lazarus, and Saint Mary Magdalene. The Magdalene was the name saint of his mother, Maddalena. Some people think that she's a portrait of his wife. I don't know that I necessarily buy that. I think it's a kind of a romantic idea. But yeah, he puts himself there.
But I'm guessing also the Lazarus may also have been a reference to his, was it his great-grandfather?
Great-grandfather, who he presents in the lives of the artists as this really great artist. And Lazzaro Vasari was not a great artist, but he is really, by including a biography of his great-grandfather, he's creating an artistic lineage. And the reference to Lazarus is something that gets repeated a couple of times. There's a portrait of him, and then there's the figure of Lazarus. Although it doesn't really look like Lazarus. This is something I've addressed, that Lazarus, you only usually ever see the scene of Christ raising Lazarus from the dead, where he's just come out of the tomb and he's all wrapped in burial garb, white burial garb. And that's not what this portrait looks like. He's, wearing fur-topped boots, and he's holding a book, which is appropriate for Vasari, right? Since he's an author. So for a while, I wasn't convinced that it represented Lazarus, but I think it's probably, he's just playing kind of fast and loose with the Lazarus iconography to get a portrait of himself in there.
I have a couple more questions before we get to Vasari's end, if I may. One is about the Pietro Lorenzetti polyptych that you had mentioned previously. So this is a very famous altarpiece that perhaps you could talk to a little bit once I finished blathering on. But a question that I have is, this altarpiece is now firmly installed at the high altar, and you see it as soon as you enter the church. And you had talked about how Vasari had moved this closer to the entrance, but where was it exactly? Do we know?
It was originally the high altar piece of the Pieve, and so he displaces this important painting. He puts it on an altar that was dedicated to Saint Christopher, that was in the second bay, so on the left-hand side of the church, where he later builds a new chapel, and so it gets moved somewhere else. But when they renovated the church in the 19th century, they very much wanted to restore the medieval Lorenzetti painting. Some of you may have had the opportunity to see this. It was in New York for the Siena, the Rise of Painting exhibition, also at the National Gallery in London. It's been recently restored by the lovely ladies at the Ricerca Restauro in Arezzo. So Vasari moves it. It used to have a predella, so there was a string of either individual saints or narratives at the bottom of it that have since been lost. It's lost all of its framing devices, so you would have had elaborate Gothic pinnacles and things. But this painting is a great example of how Vasari, when he is replacing things, he doesn't always do this, but sometimes he does, he references the works that his replace. And so if you look at the top of the Lorenzetti painting, there's a little image of the Virgin Mary being assumed into heaven. So that's the scene of the Assumption, framed by this almond-shaped body halo, something called a mandorla. And that is something that Vasari picks up on, and that is exactly why, I'm absolutely convinced of it, why he puts the little oval painting of the Virgin Mary at the top of the front of his Pieve altar. He's referencing that Lorenzetti precedent. Another thing he does, if you look at the Lorenzetti painting, on the main register, you have Madonna and Child in the center, and the Virgin Mary is wearing this really astonishingly beautiful textile. It's kind of unusual. Normally she's wearing dark blue, but Lorenzetti gives her this really beautifully patterned garment. And then if you look over to the far left, there's a bishop saint. And that is Saint Donato, who is the patron saint of Arezzo. He was an early Christian bishop. He was martyred along with some other saints whose relics were in the Vasari altar. The Pieve had the relic of his head, which is contained in a late medieval head reliquary. So Donato is there over on the far left. Vasari also puts him on the far left in an analogous position on his high altar. And one of the things that Giovanni Freni noted when he was working on the medieval Pieve is that on the feast of St. Donato, they would bring out that head reliquary of St. Donato, place it on the altar in front of this altarpiece, and there would be a corollary between the relic of the head of St. Donato and the image of St. Donato on the altarpiece, so that the two complemented each other. So that was maintained on Vasari's altar, because it is fairly certain that the rituals probably didn't change. They were still, I'm sure, carting out the head of Saint Donato every August on his feast, and putting the head reliquary on the altar, where it could again be seen in tandem with the image of the bishop saint. Vasari paints a whole figure, head to foot. Lorenzetti does not, but he's quoting Lorenzetti.
Yeah. And as you pointed out, and as many people have pointed out, this altarpiece is very, very focused on Marian imagery and the Assumption of Mary, which makes it, again, I keep coming back to this, and maybe I'm just stuck in a groove, but confused as to why Vasari didn't do something similar with his with the main painting and the altarpiece as well. I mean, one would have imagined that, given the fact that he's tipping his hat to Lorenzetti, given the fact that he's setting things up in a structurally similar way, he wouldn't have then gone ahead and made the main altarpiece also that Assumption of Mary that you suspect he was thinking about at some time before. But
you are absolutely right. It does not fit. I think Vasari, this might be one of the reasons why it contributes to the less than stellar reputation of Vasari as an artist, is that he can cut corners. He's less persnickety about things than some other artists. And I think he got his hands again on that papal painting and just said, like, okay, let's go with this one. Because that drawing at the Uffizi suggests that he originally did intend to have an Assumption of the Virgin, which is appropriate. It is not appropriate to have Christ calling Peter and Andrew. But, you know, there are various connections. And so I think it was a corner-cutting gesture that changed the iconography, because I fully agree. And I think he originally did plan to do the Assumption. Why they let him get away with it at the Pieve, I don't know. But maybe he was a good salesman. You know, I think Vasari, another thing that people don't like about him is he absolutely had to have been a schmoozer and kind of a brown noser. And I think I think that's one of the reasons that other artists did not like him that much. Although he had very good friends. He had, lifelong friendships and, pretty good, relatively good working relationships. Not with everyone.
So again, it seems like I'm stuck on this. I just want to ask one question about this drawing of the Assumption, because I realized that was a late addition to your book that you just stumbled upon, but it was quite compelling to me. In the first case, you have all these people who were pointing up, which of course is a common theme for the Assumption of Mary, but makes a lot of sense if you have a picture of Mary up, that they're actually pointing up at the picture. So the whole thing seems very coherent. As you also said, this was a sketch that was previously designed almost universally as the Raising of Lazarus, and it looks nothing like the Raising of Lazarus. So I'm wondering, before I finally move on from this topic, I'm wondering what the response of that idea that you have has been from your colleagues. I appreciate the book is coming out this month and so forth and so on, but presumably they know about it. You've written some things. There was a sense of that. Have people said to you, no, you're crazy? Have they pushed back, or have they ignored it, or have they endorsed it? What has been the response insofar as there's
Honestly,
been a response?
It is in the book, and since it was such a late addition to the book, I have spoken about it. I gave a talk about a month ago, which was really the first time that I broadcast that idea, and I showed it to a couple of Italian colleagues last year, and they were like, "Oh yeah." That makes it, all of a sudden, if you superimpose that drawing of the bottom part of an Assumption over the central panel in the high altar, it makes perfect sense that that's what he had in mind. So I have not had any pushback. But again, most people haven't read about it yet, unless you were one of the two people who I showed it to last summer, or watched my talk recently. It's not out there yet. But it was just, I had been staring at that drawing for literally years, and just like, okay, Raising of Lazarus, and just didn't think about it. And then one day looked at it a different way and just thought, no, that's not what's going on there. So I am hoping that people will accept it. But everybody who I've shown it to agree that it makes perfect sense, that that's what he originally had in mind. And then he kind of messes it up. Although that Calling of Peter and Andrew, it is an astonishingly beautiful work of art. There's a renowned scholar who describes it as Vasari's best painting, and I think she's right. It's a really good one.
I'd like to move on to Vasari's end, as you call it. You've written fairly extensively about his death. You've mentioned it a few times. But there are some really interesting concepts there, not just in terms of how Vasari himself wanted to be remembered and this notion of becoming immortalized through one's works, but also the notion of the value of a painter, which was very much in flux, as I understand it, at that time. And you also mentioned that Vasari had, of course, been the architect of the monument for Michelangelo. And perhaps you can say a little bit more about how your work on exploring Vasari's end brought in some of these larger pictures about the changing role of the artist in his contemporary society.
Okay. I really enjoyed working on this book, but I don't think I had as much fun as I did writing that last chapter, Vasari's End, which I always referred to as Dead Vasari. For me, that's what that chapter is. It's Dead Vasari. And, there's a lot of literature on Michelangelo's death and Michelangelo's tomb and Raphael's death and Raphael's tomb, which is in the Pantheon in Rome. And then there's Vasari, who, as you started off with, he is foundational, not just to Italian Renaissance art, but to the study of art history as a discipline. And there really hadn't been, there was an article that was published in the early 20th century on Vasari's tomb. And then I have a colleague, Joan Stack, who wrote a short article on the high altar, in which she talks a little bit about Vasari's death, but nobody had looked at it. And 2024 was the 450th anniversary of Vasari's death. And I had really hoped this book would be out by then. But COVID and various other things kind of conspired against me, because it would have been especially appropriate for it to have come out during that anniversary, because really that chapter is the first analysis of Vasari's death, his burial, his commemoration, and how that altar, that high altar, fits in the tradition of artists' funerary monuments, which become much more common from the 15th century, but especially from the 16th century. When Raphael dies in 1520, that's a major catalyst in which you start getting artists who are thinking kind of more carefully about their posthumous commemoration. So that was a chapter that I had, again, beautiful documentation. Now, Vasari's last will and testament, which was drawn up, the final version was drawn up in 1568. He talks about it. He says, in the Pieve, there's this chapel. I want my body carried there. I want to donate chalices and liturgical vestments, and my heirs are supposed to see to the furnishing of this. I want memorial masses celebrated each year for myself and my family on the Feast of St. George, which is in April 23rd, I think. And so he's very specific about that. And then there are agreements. There are a lot of documents that support. So the altar, if you have a funerary chapel, you endow it. So basically you provide either land or money to support the celebration of masses and all the memorial stuff that happens. And so he donated 100 bushels of good grain, specifies good grain, that came from one of his properties. He had a rural property, which is today a winery. I've never been there, but I'd love to go, at Frasineto, which is not too far from Arezzo. Life goals. These are my, visiting wineries. It'll be like a nice way to kind of culminate my work on Vasari. And so that is all documented. And then this has not been unknown, but in the Vasari family archives. So the Vasari family papers are divided between Arezzo and the Beinecke Library at Yale University, because when they formed the Vasari archive in Arezzo, they missed these Beinecke documents. I actually found a reference to the shipping of that calling of Peter and Andrew from Rome to Arezzo at the Beinecke Library. But to get back to the death, there are accounts. His family kept records of all of the things that happened surrounding Vasari's death and his burial. So we know that he was treated by doctors from the hospital of Santa Maria della Pieve. I don't think that necessarily means that he died at the hospital. I think they may have come to him at home. We know when he died. We know that he was eviscerated. They removed his internal organs, which was probably an embalming procedure meant to delay the decay of the body, because, and this is something you often did if somebody died in a place that was different from the place where they wanted to be buried. You want to be able to stave off the putrefaction as much as possible. This is how we know that they had flagellants accompany his body to the city gate before it left Florence and made its way down to Arezzo. In the documents, one of the most fun rabbit holes I went down had to do with a reference of a payment for something that they call olio di scarpioni e mandorle dolci. So oil of scorpions and sweet almonds. So it's sweet almond oil with scorpion in it. And so I was just like, what is up with this? And there is a thing called scorpion oil. And actually, there's some really good literature on scorpion oil. So Duke Cosimo de' Medici was kind of famous for his recipe for scorpion oil, which was based on earlier ones, in which you would take oil that ideally had been aged about 100 years or so. I kind of doubt that they did that. And they would typically make it in August when scorpion venom was supposed to be most potent. And you would steep all the little scorpions in the oil for a long time with like herbs and things like that. And it was an antidote to poison, but it was like a cure-all. It was like spraying Bactine on something. If you had a fever, scorpion oil. If you had insect bites, scorpion oil. And so it shows up in these records related to Vasari's death. And the Medici typically would gift the oil, internationally throughout Europe to other heads of states. But there's a payment for it. And so they bought scorpion oil, and I think it was also known to help with fevers. And so many, Vasari wasn't that old when he died. He was 63, almost 64. Usually inflammation, infection is what gets most people, along with other complications. We don't know exactly what he died from, but I think they used it to treat him. And so I got to learn a lot about scorpion oil, and there were, treatises with like pictures of little scorpions in there, and that was great fun. But he was very careful about what he wanted to happen, and the officiating at the chapel and who was supposed to do that. And he got a special papal dispensation to have what's called a diaconate. So you would have a deacon who was appointed to take care of the chapel, and so that is all well documented. And so a lot of the chapters about that. It's also about how his funerary chapel fits in with other monuments to artists. Michelangelo, Raphael, most of them are sculpted. His is predominantly painted, which is appropriate for somebody who was a painter. And that was, it was just a really nice dive into something that had not been considered as fully as I think deserved. And it's just symptomatic of, Vasari's place in the pecking order of what historians and art historians have focused on, because there's a lot there. He's the only artist I know of who had was buried at a high altar.
Yeah, and you mentioned, you just mentioned this in passing, but of course the Michelangelo monument famously is a testimony to his abilities as a painter, as a sculptor, and as an architect. And Vasari's monument, as it were, which I think is a fair way to describe it, is a testament to his painting abilities and his architectural abilities in the way that it's crafted, exactly. Which of course makes a great deal of sense given his forte.
Exactly.
Do we have... I want to ask you more questions about scorpion oil. I think we can have a whole other discussion about that.
I can talk about scorpion oil until the cows come home.
So one thing about scorpion oil. Do you have any knowledge of whether or not that still exists? Is that still a thing anywhere, scorpion oil?
Actually, I think it shows up on eBay. Go look on eBay. I think I came across something. Yeah. If I'm not mistaken, it's been a little while since I was doing all that research, but yes. People would have little scorpion rings that they would wear as like talismans. And because, Scorpio is a water sign, and so it had kind of cooling properties. So that's all tied in with it. But I think you can, now that you bring it up. I think I did come across the fact that if you really want some, you can go on. I don't know if Amazon carries it, but you can probably find some somewhere. Or else you can make your own. I mean, they have the recipe books, so you can just, in August, grab as many scorpions as possible and, DIY it.
No, I mean it's fun to see your excitement. You can really tell that you're a bit of an archive rat when you start talking about this stuff.
Any kind of research, it's detective work, and that's fun. It can be long and arduous, but when you find things, then it's just a great rush. Yeah.
Yeah. Do we have much of a record of people's reactions and responses to Vasari's death? His contemporaries? Do we have panegyrics? Do we have dismissive comments? What do we have there?
So I found all the ones I could track down, and news spread pretty quickly. So Vasari's youngest brother, he was one of 5 children. He was not the oldest. He had an older sister, but he was the oldest son. His brother Pietro writes to Grand Duke Francesco I de' Medici, who's the successor of Duke Cosimo I, and tells him about Vasari's death. The next day, Pietro Vasari goes with his sons to the Grand Duke and gifts to him Vasari's book of drawings. Vasari refers to this book over and over and over again throughout the lives of the artists because he collected drawings by other artists. And so that was given to the Medici Grand Duke. They also gave him a model of the cupola of Florence Cathedral. And word spreads pretty quickly. So it shows up, there are a number of diarists, Florentine diarists, who note Vasari's death. The news gets sent down to Rome, so there are cardinals who send their condolences. I never encountered anything negative, although I'm sure there were people in Florence who he had, ticked off and who were probably not terribly sad about it. One of the curious things is that Vasari, and I mentioned this earlier, he founded or co-founded the Accademia del Disegno, Florence's Academy of Design, which was an organization, kind of basically a confraternity of sorts, for artists and the artist community. And one of the jobs of the Accademia del Disegno was to honor their dead. So they had a chapel that's located off the cloister at Santissima Nunziata in Florence. Vasari actually painted a fresco of St. Luke painting the Virgin, and the St. Luke is a portrait of Vasari. And there was an artist's tomb in there. So people like, Puntormo and other artists were buried there. For artists who weren't buried there, usually the Academia's records talk about processions where they would go and, the members of the Academia would go carry the body in procession, and then they would go to the church and there'd be a mass. There's nothing for Vasari. I went looking. The only thing I could find in the Academia's records was just simply a reference to the fact that he died, and they got the date wrong. But also that's kind of symptomatic of what happens to the Academia's records after Cosimo I de' Medici dies. Under Francesco, they're just simply not as informative as they are before. I think the other reason is that he doesn't show up in there is that he wasn't buried in Florence. As I said before, according to his wishes, his body is sent down to Arezzo. The thing that I was disappointed in is that I couldn't find anything really about when he was buried, what happened. There are some payment records that date from, he died in June of 1574, late June of 1574. In September of that year, there are payments for things related to the funeral of Vasari. I would assume they probably buried him, immediately upon his arrival in Arezzo. But I couldn't really find anything about that. So that was a little bit disappointing. But people knew, news spread, and commented on it and sent their condolences and usually describe him as, the great knight, the Cavaliere Giorgio, and what an illustrious person he was.
Yeah. Well, he was, of course, hugely accomplished and had a very prestigious place within the Medici world. And as you say, it seems strange that the Accademia didn't do more for one of its founders. Perhaps that's a form of a slight in and of itself.
Well, and maybe they did. We just don't have records of it.
Right.
And that, actually, I'm glad you brought up that point, because that's something that comes up a lot in the literature on Vasari's lives. Well, he didn't say this, and so therefore, what can we construe from that? And I don't think an absence necessarily means that something didn't happen or wasn't See, I'm sure something happened. There are just no record. I couldn't find any records of it. Maybe someday somebody will find something, but I couldn't. And I did my darndest to, because again, it seems strange. Maybe they had mass in Santa Croce because his Florentine home was just down the street from the Church of Santa Croce. His mother was initially buried in Santa Croce. He had her relocated to Arezzo so she could be buried with the rest of the family in the Pieve.
Yeah. So just a few questions as we move towards the issue that I had at the beginning, which was about Vasari's reputation. And so there's a general consensus, at least between the two of us, who are really all the people who matter, that Vasari has been significantly underappreciated as an artist, as an architect, which isn't to say that he necessarily belongs in the very first rank, but he's certainly somebody to be taken much more seriously than he is. And perhaps he's suffering as a consequence because of the countervailing enormous impact of his lives. Do you see that changing at all? And to what extent do you hope that your work will push back a little bit towards giving more prominence to his artistic and architectural skills?
I think a certain amount of it will persist because he's an easy punching bag. But, and it's not just me. It's Patricia Rubin. There are eminent scholars, my colleague Eliana Carrara, who teaches at the University of Genoa, and others who know that, he's not a bad artist and deserves more attention. I hope that we're tempering it, but old habits die hard. So I do hope that my book will expand our understanding of him and really help to place him more alongside his contemporaries than as just somebody who documented others' lives.
Yeah. So you've worked on this particular project, which has, as you say, narrowed. I was going to say expanded, but it started off being broader than it was, and it actually narrowed. Are you thinking about picking up the threads of some of the things that you abandoned as you narrowed this, or are you moving off in different directions now? What are your current projects?
The original idea for the book was different case studies of different projects. And so two of those I've actually published on. I published an article on Vasari's altarpiece for the Buonarroti family, the large altarpiece of Christ carrying the cross, which is right next to Michelangelo's monument, which is a larger version of that small painting in Kansas that I started off with. In a way, this project is the thread, and the thread started with that little Christ carrying the cross at KU. I have another article, I just got the page proofs yesterday, of a study of Vasari's refectory paintings. When we think of refectory painting, we usually think of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, which decorates the dining hall of the Dominican convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan. And Vasari he did one Last Supper painting for a refectory, but it's actually kind of the odd one out. And so the focus of that article is a refectory that he painted in Bologna. Because instead of doing large Last Supper scenes, he tended to paint panel paintings that are very much like altarpieces, and to have very complex iconographical schemes that combine the Old Testament and the New Testament and monastic themes and things. And so that will be out later this year. So I was able to kind of get that out. I'm breaking up with Vasari. We've been together for a long time. That's not to say I won't come back to him. And I mentioned that I think it would be really fun to try to do a digital project in reconstructing the Pieve in Vasari's time. Whether or not that will happen anytime soon is anybody's guess. But what's on my horizon right now is something that popped up when I was teaching a class back in 2021. And I was doing a course on women and art in Renaissance Italy. And so it was about, women, images of women, women patrons, and then, of course, women artists. And I was doing a class one day on the painter Plautilla Nelli. So she is a Dominican nun, lived in the 16th century, painted primarily for her convent of Santa Caterina da Siena, which was located, no longer survives, but was located on the Piazza San Marco in Florence. And there's a lot of good literature on her. A lot of it focuses on her origins, her training, the fact that, she is a woman artist. But and it was another one of those kind of light bulb moments when you look at something and realize there's something else going on. And without giving too much away, I am now convinced that, yes, she was inspired by 16th century artists like Fra Bartolomeo. He was a Dominican friar, an important painter, and all of his drawings and things were at the convent of Santa Caterina. So she had those to look at. But I think she was looking as much, if not more, at 15th century Dominican art, Fra Angelico in particular. And so that's where I'm going next. I'll start on that this summer, and then I'm expecting to have a research leave next spring, which will get me back over to Florence, where I can kind of sit down and start working on it in earnest. I do not envision that being a book. I have a couple of the book took a lot out of me. And so I honestly think, I'm very happy to have done it. And I think books are very, viable projects, but like a good article that, is nice and compact and you can use it to teach with and things. I think that's more where I'm going to be going in the future. So I have Plattillanelli, and then I would kind of like to get back to my saints and relics. There's a woman by the name of Villana delle Botti. She was a 14th century blessed, a beata in Florence, and she's buried in the Florentine Church of Santa Maria della Pieve. And I think her and her relic cult need a little love, so they're on the list as well.
Just a few comments about Plattillanelli. It's funny because when you started talking about refectory paintings, her huge refectory painting, that seems like it's a spectacular work.
It is. It is now, it was in the refectory of her convent of Santa Caterina. It's now in the Museum of Santa Maria della Pieve in Florence. And it's hung pretty high up on the wall, almost a little too high, I think. So what I'm basically going to show is there is a conservatism in her art. After Leonardo, it's very uncommon to show Judas on the opposite side of the table from Christ and the rest of the apostles. That's exactly what Plattillanelli does. So it's a throwback to an older type of image. And, I'm really interested in delving into why does she do that when it is less symmetrical. It's kind of going against the Leonardo model, which she could have known through prints and things like that. She would never have gone to Milan, but, people knew the Leonardo composition mostly through prints that were disseminated and things. And so I think that she's looking back to earlier precedent to a degree that people have not acknowledged adequately at this point. And I'm really interested in learning more about how Dominican nuns were trained, the kind of theological training that they may or may not have received. We know a lot about Dominican friars. And so I'm really interested in delving into that.
Just before we leave that, are we becoming fairly confident of more works by her? Because my understanding is there aren't that many works that are fairly firmly attributed to her, but is that changing?
They keep popping up. And I've been so deeply embedded in the Vasari work that there was an exhibition at the Uffizi a number of years ago. The body of work continues to grow. I'm not absolutely convinced about all of them, but honestly, I have not spent time really parsing through that. I have a few key works that I'm going to focus on. The Last Supper is one of them. Another one is a scene of the Pentecost, which is in Perugia, in the Church of San Domenico in Perugia.
Great. Well, Sally, I've had a wonderful time talking to you. Before we conclude, is there anything that you'd like to emphasize? Is there anything that we've missed or paid too scant attention to?
I can't really think of anything, but it's been a real pleasure to talk with you about this. I mean, scholars labor in obscurity. It can be a very isolating process of, being in the libraries, being in the archives, doing the writing and the editing and the re-editing and the re-editing again. That I really appreciate having the opportunity to talk about something that, occupied not just my professional life, but overshadowed my personal life for a very, very a very long time, and we covered a lot of bases. So I appreciate having a platform in which to talk about it.
Well, you do great work. Keep on keeping on.
Thanks.
Thanks very much for watching this video podcast. For more engaging art-related content, check out our Exploring Art History Substack, our short films on our Exploring Art History YouTube channel, and Ideas Roadshow's full-length documentaries. Visit our website, ideasroadshow.com, for more details.